Welcome to Chapter 28 of our textbook, Patterns in World History, World War, and Competing Visions of Modernity, 1900 to 1945. When you hear old people say, "What is the modern world coming to?" This is it. 2 world wars, a major depression, genocide, what can I add? A Holocaust, and a whole lot of ugly feelings between a lot of different people. That's what the modern world ends up as after the 19th century. So I hope you're ready. I will warn you, though, there are some very disturbing images in this lecture. So World War I and II, or World War and Competing Visions of Modernity. There are certain historians who contend that World War I and World War II were essentially the same war, just with a 20-year peace breaking out between the two. I don't buy into that because the world situation at the start of World War II is so different than the world situation starting in World War I. So being able to tell them apart is extremely important, and understanding the differences between the two are extremely important. And in this chapter, we'll be talking about the entire world. Because the 2 wars and the Great Depression we will be discussing will hit everyone. No one will be unscathed by the wars and by the economic depression. World War I will break out in 1914 and conclude on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. That is at 11 a.m. November 11th, 1918, where the war will end in an armistice, meaning a ceasefire. The causes of the war are fascinating because they have to do with overt nationalism, people wanting self-determination, and age-old empires trying to hang on to what they had. But in general, there will be a rebellion that is brewing in the Balkans, in Serbia, which is under the direction of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1914. There will be a handful of, for want of a better word, terrorists who will be trained by Serbian nationalists and who will assassinate the Archduke Ferdinand, the next in line to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Austria and various areas of the Balkans will come to a head in the end of June, beginning of July of 1914. Austria will send an ultimatum to the Serbian government. The Serbian government will not be able to fulfill that ultimatum. It was designed that way. And Austria will then declare war on Serbia. So how did the rest of everyone get involved in it? Well, it's a process known as entangling alliances. One country agreed to be an ally with another country and signed an agreement that if one country was attacked by somebody else, then the ally would come to their help. Serbia was allied to Russia. Austria was allied to Germany. Let's see now. Russia was allied with France. Uh, the Germans were allied eventually with the Ottoman Empire because they couldn't be on the side of the Russians. Please recall, I think it was chapter 26. And so on and so forth. I will diagram it in class. Hopefully I can figure out how to use all the colors on the whiteboard. It is crazy. It is crazy how this war starts up. But it is welcomed. If you can imagine the declaration of war and the first few weeks was absolutely welcomed by many, many people. The Germans welcomed it, and the Austrians, and the French, and the Russians, and they celebrated it as a way to take care of all of these problems once and for all. They had been dealing with peace treaties, they had been dealing with agreements and diplomatic back and forth, but a war, they thought that was going to settle it all once and for all. They also thought it was going to be over by Christmas. So when the hostilities break out at the very beginning of August, we are going to see multiple countries get into a war that is so technologically different than any war that had been. It is a shock. It is an absolute shock to the European powers because by 1914, there was only one nation in that fight that had fought a war in the last 2 decades. France and Germany had not fought wars for 30 years. Uh, Russia had not. Austria had not. The only people who were relatively well trained and prepared because they had recently fought a war was the British. They had fought the Boer War in 1903, and that was against the Boers of South Africa. And so Great Britain had some idea what was coming up, but the rest of everyone did not. And so rather than romantic cavalry charges or massed infantry, those two items became deadly because of the technology of the machine gun and also the technology of the large bore giant artillery units. The Germans had an artillery unit they called Big Bertha that was so large it had to travel on its own railroad tracks that had to be properly um, supported so it wouldn't crunch in the railroad tracks. And it could launch shells for miles, never even see the gun. You would just have the shell land on top of you. And it was a giant shell. And so consequently, rather than charge at each other, that machine gun is going to mow everybody down. And so the only way to defend against that machine gun was to dig down and to dig trenches and to dig more trenches and to dig trenches connecting trenches. And so consequently, the war that was supposed to fix everything, the war that was supposed to make sure that the right people got the right solutions to it, becomes, in essence, a meat grinder of two sets of trenches facing each other. One set is German, the other set is French and British and later American. There is a no man's land between the two. that is nothing but barbed wire shell holes where shells had landed and exploded, and bodies, dead bodies of horses, and mainly men. Uh, the the carnage was unbelievable, and uh, adding to that, disease, the wet weather, and the technology that they tried to apply in to try to end the trench warfare. Uh, Such kind of technology as massive bombardments. The airplane is now out there. They're mainly dogfighting, mainly doing aerial reconnaissance, but they're also tossing a few bombs out the window. Well, no window, it was open cockpits, but they did drop bombs on occasion. They were pretty small. And of course, gas. Uh, Gas, as in poison gas, mustard gas, chlorine gas, shot gas put in artillery shells, shot over the lines in hope that it will drop down into the trenches and kill a whole bunch of people. There were also some other very nasty, um, very nasty bits of technology to clear out the trenches, like flamethrowers. That was one that the Germans had tried. It kind of backfired on them because, well, it was very easy for observers to see where the flames were coming from, and that's who you shot first. So the carnage was unbelievable. There had never been a war to match the carnage of the 4 years in the trenches, and it will become a total war. And by total war, we mean not just many, many thousands, tens of thousands of soldiers, but a draft so that enough soldiers were called up to fight. It wasn't after the first few months, it was not a voluntary thing. Men were drafted to co-fight. Um, Basically, the entire economy and government of each of the uh, people fighting the war, the nations fighting the war, everything was geared to fighting the wars. All of the factories were turned into munitions makers or um, uh, making all the things that were needed in the trenches. The people at home uh, saved food. They had ration stamps. They couldn't do all sorts of stuff. They had to save gasoline. And the uh, the because so many men had to go fight, women had to work in the factories. So I'll talk a little bit about World War One in class, but just understand it was a war that destroyed entire cities, killed many, many, many civilians, both um, accidentally and on purpose, through such actions as blockades that forced some people into starvation situations. There was also the submarine, or as the Germans called it, the U-boat for undersea, um, or Untersee, the submarine warfare. Uh, when Canada and the United States was busy sending armaments and men and food to Great Britain to support the war effort, the Germans were out with their submarines sinking those ships. So a lot of loss, casualties. The fighting for the main part was in Europe. There was some fighting in North Africa, some fighting in the Middle East, and a little bit of fighting around the Black Sea and in places like Vladivostok, Siberia, and throughout Russia. But we'll talk about that in a few minutes because that was a very unusual circumstance why troops were fighting in that area. But as far as participants, it was worldwide because you had the British still had their empire. And so many people from throughout the British Empire came to fight. There was something like 1.3 million Indians came to fight. Australians, New Zealanders, um, uh, Canadians, all through the British Empire, people came to fight. Um, and there were other colonies that sent fighters as well for France, for Germany, etc. So it was very much a worldwide war. So that concept of total war came as a shock because before this, wars were fought on battlefields. Now the whole world was a battlefield. Most of Europe became battlefields. The trenches and the supply trenches were so big that they covered from the English Channel along the Belgian French line uh, demarcation and then against the French and German boundaries all the way to Switzerland. Now, there was also fighting in Switzerland. In the southern part, the Tyrol, which was still not part of Switzerland at that point, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and you had Italians and Austrians fighting each other. But supporting the empire was an important process. The peace treaty, however, yes, it stopped the war. The peace treaty, however, will end up showing that the Austro-Hungarian Empire is basically a non-entity. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolves. The Emperor Franz Joseph dies in the middle of the war. He has no heir. And so consequently, we see the Austrian Empire broken up into component points. We see a whole bunch of new nations arise out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, out of other countries that are on the losing side. Germany loses all of its colonies and all of its investments. And in the peace treaty, which is called the Treaty of Versailles, which took about 3 to 4 years to hash out, the French, because they had paid such an incredibly high price, are going to get as much as they can out of the Germans. Now, the Austrians are gone. The Austrians were the original people that started the war, but their empire is gone. The Germans, however, are going to bear the brunt of it. The Germans will lose their emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II. He will abdicate. And so Germany is going to be forced to create a new government without the Kaiser at the top. They're going to lose their colonies. And France and England, in the process of creating this peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, is going to insist that Germany repay, called reparations, repay the winners for the losses in gold, something like $23 billion, which today would be an unfathomable amount. And this is not money that Germany had. Germany, even though it was the loser, had total war in its country, and the people of Germany were getting to the point of starvation as well. They had given up things like wheat and potatoes so they could send them to the soldiers on the front. Uh, Instead of cooking meals with the potatoes that they were used to, they cooked them with what they called ersatz potatoes. These were parsnips. And turnips. That's not a really good um, replacement. However, when you're hungry. So Germany was forced into a brand new situation. It was no longer an empire. It was a republic. And we will see all throughout Europe with Germany losing in the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a whole bunch of new countries. And one of the ideas that comes out of the Treaty of Versailles is the idea that's put forward by the American president, Woodrow Wilson, that we should base these new nations on language. And so language becomes the basis of nationhood. And so that's where we get new nations like Poland, which had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, etc. Another idea that comes the um, out of the Treaty of Versailles, also put forward by the American president Woodrow Wilson, would be the League of Nations. Wilson even offers to have their first meeting in San Francisco at the San Francisco Opera House. However, Wilson had too much opposition in Congress at home. The United States never joined the League of Nations. A whole bunch of other nations did. They were supposed to get everyone together and be like the Congress of Europe, where they would decide what was right and just, and who should go to war. And they tried ending wars. Didn't work out. They didn't have teeth. They didn't have monetary support. So the League of Nations, not going to work well. So here's the state of Europe in 1914. There is no Finland. The Russian Empire is at a very large area. Germany is at one of its peak sizes. The Austro-Hungarian Empire has this area we know as the Tyrol. Now it is part of Italy and a part of Switzerland. The Ottoman Empire is still around. And so we are basically seeing some very large empires and countries that were run as empires. And when we look at them again in 1920, they're going to be very different. Finland, the small countries of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria will lose part of its area. Hungary is now united. In the Balkans, where the hostilities started, it will be formed into one big, large country called Yugoslavia, which means Southern Slavs. Not everyone there is Slavic, not everyone there is Slavic speaking, and they are a radical mixture of Slavic speakers, Catholics, Russian Orthodox or Serbian Orthodox, Muslims. And so we are going to see a very interesting growth in that nation, Yugoslavia. Greece will be independent. The Ottoman Empire will be no more. The Ottoman Empire will not be defeated in the war so much as there will be a coup in the Ottoman Empire, and I'll talk about that. So they will have their own birth, but we will also see some big changes in the Middle East, and these are going to be absolutely crucial going forward. And we no longer see the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire collapses and it becomes something wholly new, the Soviet Union. Oh boy, we'll get to that one. But I do want to mention when I talked about the front line of World War One, it went from this point right here all the way down to Switzerland. It was continuous trenches. Um, it's kind of a big deal. The U.S. does not join the war until 1917. So it stays out for the first couple of years. It's only in there a short amount of time. The US President Woodrow Wilson was elected to his second term in 1916 with the promise that he was going to keep the US out of war. He had even basically not gone to war after a German submarine had sunk a passenger liner called the Lusitania, which happened to be one of the sister ships to the Titanic. But the Lusitania supposedly was just a uh, uh, passenger ship, but the German military put a notice in the New York Times saying that we think that there's going to be contraband. We are at a state of war with Great Britain. Any ship going to Great Britain is liable to be sunk by the German submarines. And that's what they did. Now, there is some evidence that it wasn't just passengers on the ship, that they were bringing explosives, gun cotton, as it was called back then, and other war materials, which they were not supposed to do. It was against the rules for them to put war materials and not tell anybody that they were on the ship, that they were. Anyway, so the US, all during the war, is actually going to be the nation that's going to send goods to Europe. The US will be instrumental in saving the little country of Belgium from starving to death. The person who's going to do that will be an entrepreneur by the name of Herbert Hoover. He will set up a commission, raise funds, and get food to Belgium. Otherwise, there would have been mass starvation there because the Germans had blockaded the country, but they were able to get food in there. We'll talk about Woodrow Wilson, no, not Woodrow Wilson, Herbert Hoover a little bit later on in this chapter, actually. America will be busy industrializing while the European nations are busy making war material, guns rather than butter, as the saying goes. The Americans were making guns that they were selling, and butter, and cars, and lots of consumer goods. So the Americans really didn't suffer that much in World War One. Our death rate was extremely low. However, and the book doesn't go into that, and I think it's an important point to point out. At 1918, while the war was still going on, we had a little thing called the Spanish influenza, which was blamed on Spain, but actually it probably started, I don't know where, I think in the United States. But it is an influenza that turns into a worldwide pandemic. And several million people will die because of influenza. It had not gone through anywhere in the world, so people had not built up a resistance to it. And of course, with the war, there's lots of movement of lots of people, troops crowded onto troop ships, that sort of thing. And so it spread and was going for 2 years, 1918 and 1919. And in that time, the weird thing about the Spanish flu was that uh, it affected young people more than it affected older people. That was one thing. Another thing, the US and other places had to put mask policies in place that if you went outside, you went around people, you had to wear a mask. Um, and there were anti-maskers back then who were picketing and claiming that the government was abusing its power by making people wear masks. Of course, back then, a lot of people did not believe in germ theory. So, yeah, to them, it was a complete waste. Nevertheless, the America is going to have absolutely no damage from World War One. We're going to lose only something, I'm saying only, and shame on me for saying that, but we will lose, I believe, 130,000 soldiers, which was the death count for one battle for the French and the British. Um, there were moments of World War One where 10,000 people were dying every day during the battles. Um, so yeah, as I say, we had much smaller death toll in that, and because all the other countries needed armaments and they had geared everything up to the war effort, and they still needed more. America was selling them guns, artillery, all the things that they needed for the war. And so America came out of the war as a creditor nation. Everybody owed the US money, everybody, because they had borrowed so much money to fight this war. So America is going to feel quite uh, positive about itself in some ways. Also, because 1920, getting into what we will call the Roaring Twenties, was when radio comes out. And radio was a huge game changer because instead of uh, people in the evening picking up the newspaper, um, it was a console, big, beautiful console radios in the living room. And that's where families gathered. Yes, they gathered around the radio and stared at it while they listened to radio programs. And they were basically a big deal. And they were soap operas during the day. There were music shows. There were uh, multi-part detective stories and mystery stories, and the Lone Ranger came to its own in this time. Little Orphan Annie had her own radio show. If you've ever seen the movie A Christmas Story, with the Red Ryder BB gun, that's radio culture. It got it spot on. My family remembers. They told me all about listening to Little Orphan Annie, and actually I had an uncle who had a Red Ryder BB gun. Anyway, off subject. Okay, but that's kind of the idea of the consumer culture. Also, jazz music is taking off with the syncopated rhythm. It had been considered uh, racy or just awful before World War One. After World War One, it becomes more and more popular. Now it is during this just after World War One, it changes its flavor. It is no longer the kind of uh, music that early jazz was. It is much more palatable to white people because jazz music was a black phenomenon. Um, Also, another phenomenon is Hollywood. Uh, Before 1928, movies were silent. And that's a selling point for certain movies because they were silent. You could make a movie in a studio in America and send it throughout the world because you didn't have to translate it. You probably translated the cards. There were cards, generally speaking, in the middle um, of the movies if there was important dialogue happening, and you had to translate those, but that was very cheap and easy to insert um, into the movies. Now, after 1928, when sound comes out, um, the movie that it's first shown in is 1928, Al Jolson's The Jazz Singer, and which is kind of a notable film because he does some of some of the film. Al Jolson was a very popular singer, but he does it in blackface, which is why you probably have never seen it. Um, Sadly, blackface was part of the um, milieu of the time. Uh, but movies become extremely popular, and especially Hollywood films. Americans were willing to spend money on entertainment to make it and to go to see it. And so, the one aspect that people all over the world loved to see about American films was the Wild West. Cowboy and Indian films, Western films, that's what they wanted to see in places like um, Germany, France, England. They wanted to see those big open spaces and deserts and people riding around on horses and shooting their six guns. Westerns remained popular in Europe um, until literally the 1980s and 1990s. Um, I still have a sentimental idea about Westerns because we were seeing total warfare in England, in France, in Germany, and in the United States. Uh, Women were in the factories. Women were uh, working, uh, filling in the jobs that men had, making munitions, very dangerous jobs. Women were in there, and basically because they did show that they could show up for work, they could do the same sort of work enthusiastically that men could. Uh, and then when the war was over, when the men came back, they had to go home. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them. Uh, the women got the right to vote. They fought for it and got the right to vote in 1920 in the United States. In England, I believe it took until 1922. Um, and these women who had left their homes, worked in the factories, had some of them sacrificed their husbands, brothers, fathers, uh, boyfriends in the war. They had a new feeling of independence. There's a couple of things that helped them do that as well, getting into a public life. One of the things that helped them was the bicycle. Bicycles become extremely popular at the turn of the century, and they become ways for women to get around. Horses were expensive. Not everybody had horses. Not everybody had carriages or anything, and certainly not everyone had uh, cars. So it was the bicycle that women could get out, get exercise, get fresh air. Women insisted on wearing different undergarments, bras, which were separate from corsets. The corset kept the body in, squeezed the intestines around there. They were not, from what I understand, very pleasant. However, um, they stopped wearing them. Fashion changes because of that. Rather than the pinched in waist that we saw before, we have a more uh, linear, horizontal silhouette. And one of the big changes for women in this time is the technology that had been applied to bandages in World War One to stop the bleeding, creating cellulose bandages that absorbed blood. And a company out of the Midwest called Kimberly Clark. After the war was over, they had all this factory that could make these big padded bandages. And they said, hey, we can think of somewhere else to use them. And so uh, the menstrual pad was born. And so women did not wear rags and wash them. They had disposable pads to use. And because it was much more sanitary to use them, women didn't wear the big skirts. Skirts got smaller and smaller until they no longer were close to the ground. They got higher and higher until they reached above the ankle, calf length, knee length. They didn't go much higher than that, but I mean, this was risque. This was racy. But this is what the fashions were turning into, partially because of women refusing to wear the old style undergarments, and partially because of sanitary napkins. Women are going to go to college, begin to get into fields such as nursing, teaching, and secretarial work. So throughout most of after World War One and throughout most of the 20th century, those were the jobs open to women: nursing, teaching, and secretarial work. And men moved out of those jobs and into other jobs. Um, hmm. And even up until the 1950s, women were moved into those kind of jobs and dissuaded from getting uh, more professional jobs. That's all going to change in the 1960s. But understand that while we're saying here that women are going to college and dominating certain fields, they weren't at all in any other fields, practically. Medicine, law, you didn't see women in those fields hardly at all. But because of this consumer culture, and it was really consumer culture, people were spending money on all sorts of crazy stuff. And mixed in with this, uh, and people tend to forget this, in America, we had temperance. They passed a constitutional amendment that basically banned the sale of alcohol in the United States. And this is at the same time that the Roaring Twenties are happening. So that was a huge influence on people wanting to go out and get a drink. They couldn't unless they knew somebody. Um, and that was a huge problem. But the the critics of modernity saw this consumer culture as being extremely superficial. materialistic. Um, so they poo-pooed it. They thought, oh, people are just spending money on all sorts of stuff. So there was going to be a strong current in there will be a current in uh, religion, in Christianity, known as fundamentalism. That will grow widely during the 1920s. Um, there will also be uh, what we will call the lost generation, men who are coming back from the war who had been affected. And this is going to happen in France, in England, in Germany. Men who had been in the war, men who had seen the worst of human behavior, and they did not have concepts such as PTSD. What they said was shell shock. That became the diagnosis. That guy's just shell shocked. Um, in reality, what they had were massive emotional disabilities that were completely untreated. And so many of these men turned to drink to try to lessen that problem, turned to drugs because alcohol wasn't readily available. Uh, we had kind of underground markets in marijuana and a few other things. Uh, but the idea of loss and the was big. The number of men who died in that war or who came back emotionally scarred or physically scarred was huge. And so consequently, um, we see a lot of people kind of feeling uh, wayward. They did not know where they belonged. They didn't feel comfortable back home. Um, the person who best embodies that was Ernest Hemingway, the author, who writes about his experience as an ambulance driver in World War One. So there was a lot of art that did come out of World War One, poetry, uh, some some literature, some painting. Um, but this lost generation is also going to express itself in literature, in music, and very much in film. And we will see a lot of filmmakers who went through the World War One experience who are going to come back and make very important films, very moving films in the 20s and the 30s. Women were not the only people who moved into the factories to get jobs. Many, many, many uh, poor African Americans are going to leave the sharecropping life in the South, where they were working for a pittance, and moving to cities in the North to work in the factories. There were jobs. And uh, part of this movement is going to be an artistic movement called the Harlem Renaissance. And it will be expansion of African American culture, music, literature, and art. Now, I'll talk about, at the end of the chapter, I will talk about a couple of important members of the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes, the poet and playwright, and Jacob Lawrence, the artist. I'll talk about him in class. But African American art, African American music, and literature is going to move into mainstream culture. So that will be going on between wars as far as culture. I will warn you at this moment, there is a very disturbing image coming up. Um, I will show it to you. Then I have a copy of the slide without the image. Um, but it is an image of a lynching. And um, we see businesses profiting after that, but we also see many people reacting to the movement of African Americans moving into other places. So this is a copy of the slide without the image. So the businesses are going to benefit from government's hands off, very much laissez-faire. Governments are not going to get involved. We'll have Republican presidents, we'll have conservative leaders in Europe, and they will practice laissez-faire because there is an important movement that is happening in the Soviet Union, and governments don't want to be seen as being involved with labor and business. Um, in fact, the governments will not be supporting a lot of the labor movements because they do not want to be seen as Bolshevik. And I'll explain that. Um, Also, there will be a lot of anti-immigration bias, uh, especially Jews. The immigration bias had been there all along, and at times in America, it gets really bad. In the early part of the 19th century, we had anti-Irish. Middle part of the 19th century, we had anti um, uh, Slavic and South European, Italian, and other um, uh, immigration backlash. And on the west coast of the United States, there was a huge anti-immigration bias against Asians, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Filipinos, all of whom uh, there were state laws preventing these people from purchasing land, from holding certain jobs. They were segregated into separate high schools in some areas. So the anti-immigrant bias was huge in the United States, and it had been for a very long time. And there was a lot of violence towards immigrants and African Americans as possibly a way for the white Protestant uh, population to continue its basic hegemony over government, over business, etc. Catholics were mistrusted, immigrants mistrusted. So um, it was a very nasty sort of aspect, and it wasn't just Southerners, although the Ku Klux Klan is going to have a resurgence in the teens and the 1920s as well. But there will be lynchings in the North. There will be anti-immigrant bias and anti-African American bias in the North as well. However, due to the fact that America was a creditor nation, and there were a lot of nations out there that were not uh, gaining a economic advantage as quickly as the United States. They had been bombed, they had lost factories, etc. They did not rebound very quickly. The worst was Germany, who was stuck with this huge amount of reparations they had to pay. Um, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But the policies that the Germans put in place are going to make it absolutely worse. The United States will try to rearrange the debt, but it's still not going to be enough to stop what's going to happen. Roaring 20s, consumer markets throughout the United States, and everybody else in the world owing the United States money is going to create a situation where, as far as the uh, people buying homes and people buying stocks, which seem to be going up, never seem to be falling. So real estate and stocks seem to be an absolutely sure investment. So sure, in fact, and there were not regulations against this, that people were allowed to buy on what was called a margin. In other words, if you wanted to buy $100 worth of stock, the person selling you the stock would basically let you put down 10%, $10 to control $100 worth of stock. And it was essentially whoever was selling you the stock was loaning you 90 bucks. So you were in debt, but people were making fortunes out of buying on margin and buying and selling at the right time. Um, and so that is going on. There is overproduction that is happening, and the government is entirely out of the situation. They're not doing a thing to stop it, to slow it down. It was seen as important for America to stay out of business. In fact, the Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, I keep bringing him up. He's like Napoleon. Um, Herbert Hoover is going to say the business of America is business, and the government is going to stay out of this. And so when the stock market crash happened, and it reached a tipping point, and they started to call in that debt. And it's a Friday in October, and the stock market crashed because one group is calling in that debt, and it's a that debt. There's a whole bunch of people who had bought on margin. They were in debt, so they wanted money right away to pay back that first guy. So they're going to call in the debt of a whole bunch of people, and then they're going to call in the debt, etc. It's like dominoes that are going to happen. And the stock market collapses. Investments are entirely wiped out. Banks closed, not because they didn't have money, but they were trying to keep people from running on the bank. Homes were foreclosed upon. It was a disaster. Um, Pretty soon, we had 1/3 unemployment. It was even worse in other places. Uh, you had in America, you also had at the exact same time the Dust Bowl, in which too much planting in the prairie states is going to create um, conditions for a uh, it was a drying period. They had very little rain at one point, and the topsoil had been ruined because of extensive planting. So all of a sudden, this whole arm of the farming industry is wiped out. So Americans wanted somebody to blame, and the person they're going to blame is a person who was elected president in 1928, and that was Herbert Hoover. And he was adamant. He was not going to do anything about uh, business until it was too late. And he's going to start putting in some real tiny measures. Um, not enough, not enough to stop the fall of prices, stock market, unemployment, etc. Um, and so he loses in election in 1932 to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, as he will be known. Roosevelt will come in with a whole list of programs that will be basically the government spending every dime it could to just get people to work. And we had the National Recovery Acts, we had the Civilian Conservation Corps, we had the Word Progress Administration. They called it the Alphabet Administration, NRA, CCC, WPA. There was aspects of the money investment into arts and theater. Some of the most important theater in America came out of this era. Um, and it was all government paid for by the government. So Roosevelt was doing exactly what should have been happening all along. It's going to set up brakes on the stock market, no more buying on margin. He's going to set up FISA um, to make sure the banks don't go broke, etc. So it's going to be this huge outpouring of money, the way that had never happened in the United States before. This is going to make Roosevelt very popular. He is going to get us out of the Depression. Um, and what could have happened could have been much, much worse. Roosevelt will be reelected to 4 terms in office. Um, and then he will die in office in 1945, I believe. But um, he will be president for quite some time. He'll be the only president who served more than 2 terms. The British and the French are going to have a very weak recovery after World War One, partially because they lost so many men, but partially because the infrastructure was not all that great and people are not buying things. Um, France, kind of the same way, that their post-war reconstruction was uh, kind of flaccid, kind of just sitting there, uh, not doing anything. And of course, the um, they're trying to do things like tariffs, like paying back their debts, and there's literally no government help for the businesses. Um, and of course, the government's going to need to pay back the debts that it had borrowed for the war. So what are they going to do? Raise taxes. Simple as that. And that's going to hurt their recovery effort. But the conservative governments that are in France and Great Britain are going to be quite adamant um, about not putting money towards the recovery. In fact, they're going to put in weird policies that will make it work, such as tariffs. And Great Britain is going to try to go back on the gold standard, which was a very bad economic move because all of a sudden there was no money to be spreading around. Everything had to be backed by gold, and so there was a lot of um, people who just did not have money to spend. So after World War One, the British are still going to try to their uh, keep their colonies, try to hold on to them throughout, of course, India. They will have many colonies in the Middle East. They will have colonies in Africa. The pale colors are the independent nations. So we see so many of these areas like Indonesia, India, the Middle East, and Africa still having the effects of colonization. Um, but for some of these areas, it's less about manufacturing and raw materials and more about prestige. Um, the British did not want to give up India because it was very prestigious to have India as a colony. Um, and you can see the division of the landmass. Uh, the Soviet Union, or it was Russia, it by 1936 will be the Soviet Union. They will, in fact, have a considerable empire on their hands, but not colonies. So Britain and France, uh, who are represent the leadership mainly of the League of Nations, is going to grant themselves control over much of the Middle East with the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, we will see turn over into its own nation, Turkey, but it had a whole bunch of colonies and protectorates. It will lose those. Britain and France will move in to basically stabilize those areas. But we will see a rise of British nationalism that will not, or Arab nationalism that will not want the British and French colonial implications there. The mandates that the League of Nations are going to give France and Great Britain is to prepare these areas for their own statehood. The idea being that uh, they could become their own states. And then oil was found in the Middle East. And at that point, Great Britain was very hesitant to give up all of those areas that it had nominal control over. But the British had promised support for an Arab state and a Jewish nation state after World War One. So they're working against, Great Britain is essentially working against itself. Adding to these problems is the growth of Zionism. That Zionism is basically the idea that Jews need their own homeland. And the homeland they chose is, of course, the ancient home of the Hebrews, Jerusalem, and the area we now know as Israel. But there were already people there, the Palestinians. And the British were trying to control Zionism because it led to a huge amount of unrest in the Palestinians that are there. Great Britain is basically going to try to minimize Jewish immigration into Israel, or into Palestine, as it was called. So that's going to be a huge mess. The British are going to try to keep their ties over Egypt for the sake of the Suez Canal. That canal is not just for trade anymore. That canal was extraordinarily important during wartime. So the British do not want to give that up. So the British are going to be especially harsh on the Egyptian nationalist movements. So Great Britain is working for Arab nationalism in some parts of the Middle East and against Egyptian nationalism in other parts of North Africa. It is politically a mess. The elites in Egypt wanted to keep Egypt an agricultural state because, as an agricultural state, they mainly grew cotton, and Great Britain was a big buyer of cotton. So the elites who had lots of money and land wanted to grow cotton that they could immediately sell. Meanwhile, the people of Egypt were trying to industrialize so that more people could have work. Um, so that was one of the things that led to the violence of the Egyptian nationalist movement. The um, Ottoman Empire had a movement of um, army officers known as the Young Turks who wanted to uh, basically create a secular state and get rid of the Pasha, get rid of the Ottoman Empire, and create the nation of Turkey. And the leader of this movement, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, is going to lead his Young Turks against the Ottoman government and lead a national liberation movement that will found the nation of Turkey. Ataturk had been the military hero at one of the most bloody and pivotal battles in World War I called Gallipoli. Ataturk will be uh, the guy ordering the shelling of the Anzac troops, the uh, um, um, Australian and New Zealand troops trying to land on Gallipoli. It was a intense moment. So it is Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who is going to end the caliphate. That's it. So that there would be no more caliphate, and it was ended by decree. Um, Ataturk wanted a pluralistic government. He wanted modernization. He banned headgear such as the fez. He banned anything but Western clothing. He encouraged women to dress in current fashions, come out in public, not veil themselves. And he wanted to have Turkey for the people of Turkey, which meant that he wanted to drive out the Bulgarians, he wanted to drive out the Greeks, and he wanted to drive out the Armenians. Um, and this is a moment that is horribly controversial called, in the West, we call it the Armenian Genocide, in which Turkish troops force Armenians to leave the country. And they are not given sufficient food and water and time to organize. Uh, the Armenians had been leading a guerrilla warfare against the Turks, and that was basically the excuse the Turks gave for driving the Armenians out. But even today, there is a lot of controversy over the Armenian genocide, and you will find um, certain groups will say it absolutely happened, and other groups will say it never happened or it's all their fault. So this is like one of those issues of history that's still not really accepted. India will continue its demands for independence after World War I. After all, there had been um, uh, Sikhs, there had been plenty uh, of Indian troops who had fought for Great Britain in World War I, possibly with the idea that maybe they could be rewarded with independence. The movement towards uh, independence is going to have a leader, Gandhi, who will be an advocate for nonviolence. He will be an interesting individual who will be an Indian who was educated in England as a lawyer. Uh, this was under the civil service program, and he comes back to India and he helps to form an Indian nationalistic movement. However, he is completely dedicated to nonviolence. Uh, and so trying to work within those parameters is going to be extremely difficult. One of the examples of what he does as far as trying to undermine British rule in India is called the Salt March. In 1930, the British government had slapped a tax on salt. And Gandhi decided that that was something that he wanted to protest. So he led a march of poor people to the sea to get their own salt so they did not have to pay the British tax. So it was a march of tens of thousands of people, mainly poor, unarmed. Um, and the British sent troops to beat them up. They did quite a bit of harm. They killed many people during this. But it was a political movement dedicated to nonviolence. Um, the in 1935, the British government is going to pass the India Act, in which it will release some of its control to the National Congress, which was the leading group um, in India. But the National Congress tended to be Hindu led, and the British are going to be supporting at the same time the Muslims in India. They will uh, basically sponsor massacres of Sikhs by Gurkha troops in the 1920s. Uh, so the British will be, on one hand, giving a little bit more power to the National Congress, and on the other hand, supporting Muslim leagues that are going to be against the Indian National Congress. So we will see still more conflict in India um, based on religion. We've been talking about that for quite some time, but it's going to be continuing. Latin America. There's not a lot to talk about Latin America. It's growing urbanization, immigration to Latin America from places like Asia and others. They're going to try to put in place industrialization um, and try to redistribute land to the poor. There will be, governments in each of the different nations, and they will be uh, pulled between those people who were agriculturalists who want land redistribution and those in urban areas that want industry. Um, the large international markets that invest, they're international businesses that invest in Latin America, essentially for cash crops such as bananas or mining interests, etc. They are going to be pivotal in getting Latin America through the Depression without a huge amount of unemployment. Uh, but uh, those areas that do not have foreign investment in them, some of the smaller countries, they will not fare as well as some of the bigger countries. So now we have to go into what happened in Russia. Russia, at the start of World War I, was an empire. It was led by a Tsar, Tsar Alexander II. But it had very little in the way of industry, and it was considered not a strong country in Europe, but uh, it could mount an army of 1 million men. And even 1 million men with sticks is a formidable weapon. Actually, they didn't have sticks. They put many, many men in the field to form what will be known as the Eastern Front. It's the Eastern Front of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the beginning of the war. And the other allies, France and Great Britain, desperately wanted them to stay in the war because it forced Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire to fight two front wars. And two front wars are the one thing a country never, 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 never wants. And so keeping Russia in the war was absolutely crucial for the Allies. This is not going to be popular with the Russian people. The the soldiers that were sent to the front were sent without adequate clothing, without adequate training, without adequate weapons, without adequate boots, and said, when you get to the front, just get your boots and your coats and your weapons from the dead guys. This caused a lot of problems in the military. So much so that even though Nicholas II was the Tsar, even though he himself led the armies, he was doing a terrible job. And it becomes extremely obvious that he was doing a really piss poor job. And so he will be forced to abdicate, and uh, a group of his cabinet, his advisors, will form what's called the provisional government. And this is in February of 1917. At the same time, the Allies are telling this provisional government, you must stay in the war no matter what. And they were sending materiel to Russia so that they would stay in the war. And so the provisional government in February of 1917 agreed they were going to stay in the war and form that Eastern Front. But the fighters were not interested in staying in the war. The Germans had a really sneaky plan. They were going to encourage revolution, a communist revolution in Russia. There had been movements towards it, and there was a leading philosopher and writer about that movement named Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Lenin was his nom de guerre, his name of war. But he had been in exile in Switzerland throughout most of the war. But when the provisional government takes over, the Germans are going to smuggle Lenin out of Switzerland and send him to Russia to foment revolution, because they knew he was going to do it. And do this he will. And this is known as the Bolshevik Revolution. So from the provisional government in February of 1917 until that summer, the provisional government is going to be semi-successful. They really have not much to work with. But the Bolsheviks are gaining power with the military, the Navy and the Army, who are sick and tired of the war, and they want out. And so consequently, Lenin is going to promise that if they join the Bolshevik Revolution, that they will get peace, land, and bread. That was his revolutionary cry: peace, land, and bread. And so the military joins him. And in October of 1917, the revolution happens. And it is a violent revolution that overthrows the government, the provisional government. The leaders of the provisional government either are killed or have to escape. And now the Bolsheviks are in charge. Lenin has to make good on his promises. And so he does. Lenin has to form a peace with Germany. And Lenin signs with German leaders a treaty called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. I'll have to write it for you when we get into class. It is in your book, by the way. This treaty basically says Russia, or the new Bolshevik nation, is going to pull out of World War I. The Eastern Front is gone, and to make sure that Germany realizes that the new Bolshevik country will not attack them, they're going to give up a huge amount of land to Germany. So Germany's going to gain a huge amount of territory. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks have to form their own government, and it's going along in a very bumpy, difficult way, because there are forces who, throughout Russia, who are still wanting the provisional government. They are being paid and sent material by the Allies in World War I. France, Great Britain, the United States, now Italy, and Japan. They're forming military units in Vladivostok, and they are fighting the Bolsheviks directly. This is what's known as the Russian Civil War, and it goes on for several years, even beyond the end of World War I. The Bolsheviks are known as the Red Russians, and their enemy in the Russian Civil War are known as the White Russians. The drink is named after them. But they will fight a horribly bloody civil war that will eventually be won by the Bolsheviks. Meanwhile, the World War I has ended in 1918, and the Allies kind of withdraw their support for the White Russians, and that's it for the White Russians. They get killed off. So Lenin forms his new government, and I will discuss what that government is, because Lenin wants to form a communist government. That's his goal. And he is a student of Marx. And remember how I said that with Marx's idea, this communist government would be the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, boom, are going to have their conflict, and then you get that flat line of the communist government. Full total communism means that there will be no state. The state will fade away according to the formula worked out by Marx. Eventually, all nations will fade away with the communist uh, revolution. Lenin truly believed that once he won the Bolshevik Revolution in October of 1917, that all of the workers stuck in the trenches throughout Europe would say, the communist revolution has happened. We are no longer fighting for our corporate overlords. And Lenin expect them to throw down their gun and say, hey, we're in charge now. Doesn't happen, to Lenin's surprise. What does happen is that those governments that are not part of the communist revolution are going to double down on their anti communist ideals. And so Lenin will be forced to form a government. It's not going to fade away on him. And in fact, Lenin works out a new proposition, which he will call the dictatorship of the proletariat. That Russia, now called the Soviet Union, is going to need a revolutionary vanguard of professional revolutionaries who will lead the way to the eventual communist government. And then the state will fade away. So, what Lenin puts in place is a government that is totalitarian by its very nature. Lenin dies in 1924, has a stroke and dies, and his successor, Joseph Stalin, Stalin takes a couple of years to become leader. It was either him or Lenin's second in command, Trotsky, and Stalin wins. Lenin did not want Stalin to win, but Stalin wins. He is now the leader of the Soviet Union. In order to prevent Russia from being attacked again, Joseph Stalin is going to take complete control of everything in the government and basically turn a majority agricultural country such as Russia into a highly industrialized state as quickly as possible. And too bad for anyone who stands in the way. Stalin is going to collectivize the farms. The people who actually owned the farms and ran the farms and were able to grow food for the entire nation in the area we know as Ukraine. That's the breadbasket of Russia. Stalin is going to claim that these guys are the enemies of the states. He's going to call them kulaks, which means fist, which is with the idea that they're money grubbers. You know, they grab onto the money. Stalin was extremely anti Semitic, so there were anti Semitic overtones in what he did. So he blames the kulaks for trying to wreck communism. And so he basically sends the army in to take all of their food, everything that they grew. And in his term, liquidize the kulaks. The farms that the kulaks were on will be collectivized, and people who did not know how to run farms are now running farms. But everything is property of the government. Every inch of land, every business, everything. Lots of small businesses were forced to quit. The kulaks, Stalin fomented and created a famine to kill them off. Um, he basically took every scrap of food that they produced for several years and they starved to death or were killed or a few left. That was what liquidation meant. Um, but Stalin is going to turn every aspect of the Soviet Union into um, into creating this model state that was industrialized. He will do it because he has control over everything. Every every nut, every bolt, every scrap of food, where people lived, everything was under his control. And they modernized by the start of World War I, which was a scant 18 years after, no, less than that, after Stalin comes into power. Um, the Soviet Union is an industrialized state, but the cost is horrific. Things like show trials. Show trials were a way to basically point out that there were people in the population who were wreckers. They wrecked things. And these people kept the good Soviet workers from meeting their quotas. They had quotas they had to meet. If they didn't make their quota, rather than shoot the people doing the work, uh, Stalin found people who he called wreckers, a lot of Jews. And these people, whether they had anything to do with it or not, were arrested, were tortured, were forced to memorize a speech, or they were basically said, "We will kill your family in horrible ways if you do not memorize this speech." And so, through torture, they learned the speech, and then they were put on trial. And the radio broadcasts of this trial went out throughout the Soviet Union. Films were filmed of these trials. This is all part of the Great Terror of 1937. Um, and the people who were accused of um, being wreckers would stand up, uh, give their memorized speeches, which often ended in "Long live Comrade Stalin." Sometimes they ended in "If I were you, Mr. Judge, Comrade Judge, I would have me taken out and shot like the rabid dog I am." And the judge would say, "Boom, fine, take him out and shoot him." That's what they did. These trials were meant to put fear into everybody, but at the same time, not blame the workers. You know, as Stalin supposedly once said, you have to crack a few eggs in order to make an omelet. In the time of terror, you don't have to kill that many people, but you do have to do it very visually. The French learned this in the French Revolution and their reign of terror, and Stalin learned it in his. And it is much easier to torture someone until they admit their wrongdoing than go through these trial things. I mean, that was just juries and evidence and prosecutors. Who needs that? Get the guy up there, film him making his confession, broadcast his confession throughout the country, take him out and shoot him. Also, part of this terror was the Gulag. Gulag was a network of prison camps way out in Siberia. where they would basically have quotas of people to arrest given to the what was the uh, early movement that would become the KGB, gave them lists of numbers of people to arrest, not necessarily people to arrest, just numbers. And we have in Stalin's own handwriting, because he wrote with a red crayon. Um, he used to be an editor of a newspaper, so that was what he would use to correct. And we see, these list of numbers. They'd have a list of city, and then the numbers of people to arrest, and the number of people to send to the gulag, and another number of people to execute. And he would cross the numbers out and write double the numbers in the margins. It was entirely about getting people so scared they would self police and do whatever the leadership told them to do. So that was the Great Terror. Everyone was afraid of Comrade Stalin. So now we get into a second totalitarian movement, and that is fascism. Now, fascism was entirely made up by one man, Benito Mussolini. He'll have some thinkers that will come along and help him later on, but it is Mussolini who comes up with the idea. Mussolini had been a newspaper editor for a socialist newspaper. But when World War I happens, he is pro war. He thinks that Italy needs to get into the war and get as much land as they can. And the socialists did not want to go to war. Um, a lot of people wanted to go to war in World War I, except for two main groups: socialists, certain socialists, and bankers. Bankers knew that this would totally upset the economics of the world. They were right. But so Mussolini breaks with the socialists because he is pro-war. And after World War I, he basically starts his own party called the Fascist Party. It is a reaction to socialism and communism. It is not a leftist movement. It is a consciously right movement. Fascism was a response, not a support to socialism. Meanwhile, after World War I, Italy, even though it had changed sides and had been on the Allied side, ran into economic problems after the war. They did not get what they thought they should have deserved. More men per capita died in Italy than any other country in World War I, even more in Germany. And so Mussolini is watching as Italy is going through severe economic problems. And Mussolini comes up with the idea of fascism as a way to unite people to support the state and support basically a corporate state. And so he gets former soldiers around him to form something of a informal militia. They carried knives around. They liked knives, and they wore black shirts. They were known as the black shirts. And they gathered around Mussolini, and Mussolini would be on the radio constantly making speeches about we have to get rid of socialism. We need to make Italy strong. And Mussolini will, in 1923, announce a march on Rome. And this is very much like Garibaldi did in the Italian nationalist movement in the 19th century, and what Julius Caesar did in ancient Rome to become the Roman emperor. Well, Mussolini follows suit. He gets thousands of supporters, and they're joined by more thousands of people to march on Rome. He doesn't say what he's going to do once he gets to Rome, but he has a lot of followers. And so the government gets frightened by him, and they agree to allow Benito Mussolini to become the Italian equivalent of chancellor. He then gets his fascist in the Italian parliament. He does this with the permission of the King of Italy. Italy still had a king at this point. It was a constitutional monarchy. And he takes the prime minister's spot as well. So he has the power in his hand. That's why he is called Il Duce. Il Duce means the two. He is chancellor, he is prime minister. He is the head of Italy. And he changes, or at least attempts to change Italy in his own ideas of fascism. His ideas of fascism was end labor movements. All workers are now in a single labor movement that is sponsored by the state. All businesses need to join in with this fascist state. And Mussolini would allow them to keep their businesses and made sure that their workers would not strike, which was a big problem for these corporations, for these factories. And the businessmen thought this was great. So they supported Mussolini. And Mussolini spent a huge amount of money, mainly deficit spending, to bolster people who are unemployed, give them work, put them in the army. And he worked very, very hard to get rid of democracy. He didn't want democracy. He thought that was a weak way to go. And he worked very, very hard to get rid of socialism. He did not want socialism. And so he patently, obviously, set up a state that was run by him and him alone. And he called this fascism. Fascism is a term taken from a Roman concept. In fact, a lot of the symbolism, etc., of fascist Italy is taken from the ancient Romans. I'll talk about that in class. But Mussolini will build up the army, and in order to get the nationalist feeling going in Italy, he's going to attack Ethiopia and Libya. Neither one to very much success in the long run. But Germany is where some of the major problems will be, as you probably can expect it. So at the end of World War I, when the Germans surrender, it is the generals who surrender. Kaiser Wilhelm abdicates before the peace treaty, before the armistice is signed on November 11th, 1918. And so, who's going to take over the government? Government's gone. And so a group of parliamentarians are going to take their parliamentary system and create a republic. And they are doing so in the city of Weimar. So this republic is known as the Weimar Republic. But with the problems of the war, with the unemployment, and with the onerous reparations that the rest of the Europeans are going to put on Germany, the German economy is going to fall apart. They cannot make the payments, and they cannot keep the government uh, essentially going. Now, the Weimar Republic was mainly social democrats. Uh, that was the largest political party in Germany. And so they were mostly social democrats. Um, and with the Treaty of Versailles, that was signed a couple of years after the end of the war, it is the Weimar government who must accept the peace treaty, who must accept um, the reparations, who must accept the fault for the war. They had nothing to do with it, but they're stuck with it. And so um, when the German economy implodes, it truly does that. The Weimar Republic, in order to try to pay back reparations and everything, hit upon the idea of printing more money. And those of you who have studied economics realize you're going to have inflation if you print too much money. And that is what the Germans had. In the 1920s, they could not print enough money. Stories of people using wheelbarrows of money to go to the store and buy a loaf of bread. People being able to afford that loaf of bread at 8 a.m., but for some reason not going to the store. And by 5 p.m., when they got off of work to buy that loaf of bread, they couldn't afford it anymore because inflation had gotten that bad during their workday. These kids, these young German children, are playing with blocks of Deutschmarks, billions and billions of Deutschmarks. You could find uh, postage stamps that they didn't have enough money to reprint the stamps to make it add more zeros. So they just had rubber stamps that they stamped on the postage stamps that turned them into million Deutschmark stamps. Um, it was really bad. The factories had a huge problem with labor strikes, and the communists were uh, trying to start their own version of the Russian Revolution. They were looking to try to start a revolutionary movement in Germany. There were some um, leaders of the Communist Party who did not want to do that. Uh, Social Democrats, for the main part, the big splitting point between communists and social democrats was that the social democrats wanted to get elected as a legitimate political party and make slow advances in going towards their more socialist agenda. The communists wanted revolution, they wanted violence, and they wanted it to happen right now. And that was the dividing point. And the Social Democrats could not support that. But there was violence in the streets. The communists were fighting, the strikers were fighting. And in order to put down these street battles, the Weimar government basically uh, told all the soldiers that had come back from the front, who still had some of their uniforms, who still had weaponry. The Weimar government said, "We want to form a a militia known as the Freikorps, um, and here's weapons, and here's armored vehicles. Go put down the violence." And so these Freikorps, these militia, went out to put down the street violence. Um, but all of this violence in the streets and the inflation and everything that's happening um, made for openings for anyone who was going to come around and promise to fix it all. And that's where we get the Nazis. So the Nazi is short for National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. Um, it's way too long to say. Um, um, in German, the initials are NSDAP, but everyone called them Nazis. They will start running in political elections. The party itself had started out as something of a workers' party. And then in the middle of the 1920s, a young man, a former soldier in the German army named Adolf Hitler, will come to their meetings. And then he slowly works his way up the ranks to be the head of the party. And he reforms the party along the lines that he saw Mussolini do. He adopts fascism. And in 1928, they try to take over the government. They start in a very dumb way. They go to a beer hall in Munich, get drunk, and then decide to go take over the government. The government's not in Munich, but they come out and start up their own street violence, and they are put down rather ruthlessly by the police. And Hitler is arrested and he's arrested and sentenced to 2 years in prison. He spends 6 months in prison. And while he's in prison, he dictates his autobiography called Mein Kampf, which is German for my struggle. He's still a young man, but what Mussolini did not have that Hitler will establish is that Hitler was virulently anti Semitic. He hated Jews. And he had been anti Semitic since he was a teenager in Vienna, Austria. He falls into uh, a group of anti Semites. It had been something of a political party in Vienna before World War One. But Hitler, in fact, when World War One starts, he's extremely excited about it, and he joins the German army and uh, fights on the front line. He only goes up to, I believe, the rank of corporal, but he is gassed. He is wounded by the gas, and he earns an Iron Cross, second class, which is better than what Mussolini had ever done. But Hitler comes back to Germany after the war and is completely disillusioned. And that's why he falls in with the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. And he reforms it in the same way that he's seen Mussolini form his party. And the Nazis start running for local elections as a party in 1928-29. They start gaining a few seats here and a few seats there. Uh, I could go more into detail. I won't. But they very cleverly use radio. In the elections in 1930, the Nazis will win not a majority of seats, but they will win a substantial number of seats. And they, in order to make a parliament work, you need to have a majority and a minority. And the Nazis refused to join a coalition with anyone else uh, unless the president, who was Hindenburg, would put Adolf Hitler in the position of chancellor. And they bother Hindenburg, who was a very old man, to the point where Hindenburg agrees. So the Nazis never win majorities even into 1932, but Hitler is never elected prior to that. He is installed in an office by Hindenburg. There will be a suspicious fire shortly after he takes power in the parliamentary building, the Reichstag, and it will be blamed on anarchists. And Hitler will use this moment, which is called the Reichstag moment, to start forcing through laws. He will outlaw political parties, except his. He will take full control of the state. He will call martial law. And he will use his power to turn, or at least try to turn, the economy around. He bans labor unions. He makes everybody part of the single labor union. He goes to the heads of the businesses and says, if you will support me, I will make sure your factory is never struck. And so, of course, the businessmen agree. Those handful of businesses who do not agree, they either go out of business or the Nazis take them over. They don't have to take over very many businesses, but they will control the people. They will control what the people are doing. They will put a huge amount of controls on everything, and they will start to rearm Germany. One of the provisions in the Treaty of Versailles was no arms for Germany. And Hitler will just say, don't care, and start creating armaments. Um, and so we see unemployment go away. We see infrastructure being built, the autobahns, the highways around Germany are being built with deficit spending, but I mean they're being built by the Nazis. Um, the the they start turning out a small automobile that people can afford, the Volkswagen, which means the people's wagon. They put out radios that only can receive one channel, which is the state channel. It's a Volks radio. Um, they do all these things to fully control the state. And that's basically about how we're going to see World War II start. Um, Actually, just before World War II, 1935, we will see a civil war in Spain. It's very bloody, and it is the king and Republicans against communists, against fascists who are supported by the military. And the leader of the fascists is Generalissimo Francisco Franco, and it is the fascists who win. But Italy and Germany send armaments to check out, to help out the fellow fascist. So we kind of see a um, introduction to what World War II is going to be like. In 1938, or 1939, sorry about that, Hitler wants to make sure that the problems of World War I do not happen. He has a plan to attack to the west, and he comes up with another plan to make sure that he is not attacked by the Soviet Union. He gets into an agreement called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, in which the Soviet Union and Germany agree not to attack each other. However, there is a secret clause in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, non-aggression pact, that basically the Germans and the Soviet Union divide up Poland. And the Germans say, okay, Soviets, you can have this much of Poland and we'll take the rest of it. They don't let people know about that part. But in signing this non aggression pact, um, Stalin thinks that, oof, he's avoided a war, and Hitler thinks, oof, I've avoided fighting on two fronts. Um, in, in, in the late 30s, the Anschluss will happen. That is the official term for when Germany just kind of moves into Austria, and the Austrians are greet them as liberators. And so now you have Greater Germany. You have Germany and Austria as essentially the same country. And then a little bit later, you've got the German speaking part of Czechoslovakia will go to Germany, the Sudetenland Agreement. And then after the Germans get the German speaking part of Czechoslovakia, they go ahead and take the Czech speaking part of Czechoslovakia uh, without very much fighting, and the Europeans do nothing. In fact, the Europeans look at what they're doing. They send Neville Chamberlain, their prime minister, there. Neville Chamberlain meets with Hitler, with Mussolini, and the man who's representing Czechoslovakia is out in the hallway, not allowed to come into the meeting. Meanwhile, Neville Chamberlain agrees to the Munich Agreement in 1938, which basically gives Czechoslovakia to Hitler. And Neville Chamberlain comes back. We have film footage. Comes back to England, gets off the plane, waves the Munich Agreement in his hand, and says, "We have peace in our time," because nobody wanted to go through World War I again. In some ways, you can forgive that, but in other ways, they gave away Czechoslovakia. They had no right. The Englishman Neville Chamberlain says, it's a small country of which we know very little. Give me a break. Anyway, so Hitler gets Austria without firing a shot. Hitler gets Czechoslovakia without hardly firing a shot. And in 1939, September 1st of 1939, Hitler finally says, okay, Poland's next. And he invades Poland. And the world gets to see what it's like trying to fight against Germany, because Germany has entirely changed its tactics with its new technology. Heavy artillery, tanks, and airplanes. The dive bomber, the Stuka dive bomber. And what the plan is to take Poland as quickly as possible. In fact, the tactics the Germans call Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war. And it is. It is warfare that is faster than anyone could ever imagine. And Hitler takes Poland, and it's at this point that Great Britain and France basically decide, yeah, Hitler's going to start fighting. And then Hitler takes France, or at least the northern part of France, takes Belgium, takes Denmark. Blitzkrieg happens in a way that no one else is prepared for. They should have seen this coming in the Spanish Civil War of 1935, but they don't. And eventually Hitler takes a lot of Western Europe. He's allied with Benito Mussolini in Italy, and he's got a third ally, Japan. I'll talk about them in a few moments. But eventually, Hitler's got, and Mussolini have got most of Europe. And this is when Hitler breaks the Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggression pact and attacks the Soviet Union. This is what Stalin has been afraid of and what he had prepared for, but he thought he was fairly safe with the non aggression pact. Well, not so much. And the Germans move into the Soviet Union in a big way. They have circled Leningrad. They are almost to the gates of Moscow, and they get to a town that was named after Stalin called Stalingrad. And this is going to be the super heavy fighting. Now, the Germans were initially planning on going through the Soviet Union, taking a right, and heading south to the Middle East because they had no natural sources of oil. And of course, Blitzkrieg needed oil. Um, and had they concentrated on turning right, going south, and getting to the oil fields of Iran and Iraq, World War II would have come out very differently. But they didn't. They concentrated on taking the city of Stalingrad. And it was a horrible, bloody 2-year fight. Um, the stories of Stalingrad are numerous and really horrific. But meanwhile, the ideas that Hitler had espoused in his book Mein Kampf that were virulently anti Semitic, uh, he will visit on the Jews. After he takes power, he's going to start very slowly slipping away rights from Jews. He takes away rights of citizenship. He takes away rights to vote. He takes away rights of movement. He takes away their ability to arm. And eventually, we see him attempt to wipe out the Jewish population of Europe. And this is the building of the concentration camps and, of course, the final solution. Now, the concentration camps originally held political prisoners, and then they're going to be filled up with Jews, with the attempt of turning them into slave labor. Um, it it's not there's just not the control mechanism to do as much slave labor as they hope to, although there will be a lot. Um, and so eventually we will see him attempt to eliminate all Jews in Europe. That is one of his goals. And uh, he's going to get rid of mentally deficient people. He's going to get rid of the Roma people. We know them as gypsies. He's going to get rid of communists. Um, he applies the final solution to a lot of people, but his intended target is very much Jews. The U.S. is very late getting into the war, into World War II. We don't join it until the December of 1941. We wouldn't have joined it had Pearl Harbor not happened. When the Japanese attack America. But when the Japanese attack America and the Americans declared war on Japan, then Germany declared war on the United States. So we were in the war. And we basically, the United States turned the tide with our fighters, with our goods, with our technology. Ugh, the technology of World War II, I can talk about it for days. But, and I've already talked about everything too long. So we see the US coming in, fighting with the British, fighting with the French, and eventually eliminating the Nazis from the West. Stalin is eliminating them from the East. And I will talk next chapter about the ramifications of allying with Stalin, because Great Britain and France and the United States were allies with Stalin and the Soviet Union against the Nazis. So that's important to know. Um, So at um, the Germany in World War II, at its greatest extent, this is including Italy and Italy's um, colonies. Uh, it's going to be huge. Stalingrad is, of course, right here. But if you notice, had they gone down here, they could have started taking oil rigs all the way in here, and they would have been uh, aptly supplied to continue warfare. Um, so uh, it was a mistake on their part. So let's get to Asia, because Asia played a entirely different theater in this war. Um, Japan had grown highly militaristic under the Meiji Restoration. They had invaded Manchuria, creating a puppet state known as Manchukuo. They had come with the Allies during World War I into Vladivostok, Siberia, with 60,000 troops, and were looking to take parts of Siberia, but they were held off by the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War. But the Japanese increase their production. But Japan is, of course, in many ways, a resource poor country, does not have oil, does not have a lot of iron, does have some coal, does not have rubber. And those are what the highly technical uh, and technologically superior nations needed. And so Japan is going to come up with an idea. They are going to market it as anti colonialist, that we're going to get the Europeans out of Asia once and for all by forming what Japan would call the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Their stated goal is to get Japan and Korea and China and Vietnam and all the areas in Asia and the South Pacific Islands, get them in one big economic sphere, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Because within this sphere were all the raw materials that Japan needed. And so their idea was, we form this big economic union and we can have whatever we want. In the meantime, they had been interfering with Chinese politics. That's invading Manchuria, setting up a puppet government in Manchukuo, etc. But China had gone through its own revolution. It had tried to get rid of the emperor, and there was a nationalistic revolution happening in China in 1911 under the leadership of a man named Sun Yat-sen. And he tried to set up a republican government. However, there were communist parties that opposed him setting up this government. And that's going to set up something of a civil war, beginnings of a civil war in China between Sun Yat-sen, who was trying to set up a republic, and this man, Mao Zedong, who was a communist and wanted to set up a communist government. Sorry, I should have warned you about troublesome images. Uh, China's fighting between the nationalists and the communists is going to go on throughout the 20s and 30s. Japan is going to encourage this fighting because it made China weaker. The communists are going to have most of their support in rural areas because they promised land redistribution so that peasants would finally get their own land. The Japanese are going to move in and try to get rid of the nationalist Republican government. By this time, Sun Yat sen was dead, and the nationalist government was led by Chiang Kai shek. So, uh, in order to make sure they have gotten the government out of the way, the Japanese are going to start in 1937 an all out military assault on China. And this is known as the Rape of Nanjing, where they take the capital of Nanjing and start killing people. It is a genocide of unbelievable proportions with um, stories of murder by bayonet practice, shooting, beheadings with samurai swords. It is horrific. And some of it was captured on film, and it is broadcast, sent out in movie, the news trailers that were sent out as the Rape of Nanjing, as this see what the Japanese are doing to the Chinese. So it becomes a cause celeb around the world. That the world is saying, wow, these guys are definitely the aggressors. Well, Japan is not going to bother to take all of China, just the areas near the coastline. They will take all of Korea. They will take all of French Indochina, Vietnam. They will uh, then move out in a move known as island hopping, where they will go from one island to another and take it over. And they will take over the American territories in the Philippines. They will take over British and Dutch territories, um, and use them and extract the raw materials, just as the British and the French and the Dutch and the Americans had in prior centuries. But the Japanese are afraid of the United States getting into the war. And so they work up this plan of bombing Pearl Harbor, which is in Hawaii. The American Department of War, used to what we now call the Department of Defense, had done the math and said this was impossible. There is no way the Japanese could get to Pearl Harbor by ship. Um, they suspected that Pearl Harbor might be taken by espionage, not by out and out fighting. Well, December 7th, 1941, a day which will live in infamy, the Japanese military had figured out how to get to Hawaii and bombed Pearl Harbor. America's battleships in the Pacific were trashed. Many of them sunk. The Pearl Harbor itself suffered huge amounts of damage, but our aircraft carriers, which were not considered that important, had been out on maneuvers. They were safe. And so the evening of December 7th, it's decided the U.S. will declare war on Japan. They do that the next day, and the uh, the Germans then declare war on the United States a day or so later. And so the United States is in a two-front war. There is an Atlantic theater where they're uh, trying to take back Europe, and there is the Pacific theater where they're fighting against the Japanese. And the Americans start island hopping, trying to take island after island after island. So uh, I said two front wars are bad, uh, but through exhaustive effort, through a total war attitude, and through a hell of a lot of sacrifices by people at home, as well as the men and women fighting overseas, the United States is going to help Britain, and it's going to fight a two front war. Now, if you note, the USSR is right here by Japan. They don't do anything in the Pacific. They do nothing in the Pacific. Stalin ignores it. Um, so he avoids having a two front war. He's more worried about the Nazis. So America, Great Britain, France eventually win the war. But it's not the end of problems. It just essentially gets rid of the threat of fascism. That basically ends. But it is clear once that once we start looking at it, fascism is only one style of totalitarianism in which the state is in total control. And I'm speaking, of course, of Stalin in the Soviet Union. So, uh, next chapter, we'll get into the Cold War. You're going to be on my home base now, because that's what I studied. And so, definitely is a crucial aspect of our present lives. So, I promised I'd talk a little bit about the Harlem Renaissance. This uh, um, lecture has gone on way too long. So, I will talk a little bit more about it in class. It is more than worthy of uh, study. Langston Hughes will be writing phenomenal poetry and literature. The painters of the Harlem Renaissance will be extraordinary painters. I'll show you some of their works. Um, and we'll just see this incredible growth of culture and the rest of America starting to embrace it. I think that's a big deal. That's going to go on. Is the acceptance um, and the eventual love that people will have for this culture. All right, so uh, this is the. I'm going to end this lecture here. You are champions for making it this far. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to discussing this with you in class on Thursday or whenever our class is. Take care.